Well, as if we couldn't say this before, we are living in interesting times, are we not? Um, would I have thought that all of the historical things that have happened in the last few years would ever happen at this point in time? Uh, not, not when I was in grad school. I wouldn't have. I was convinced then by the ideology that neoliberal, or what we now call neoliberal economics, would bring interdependence to the world, and with that would come peace and prosperity. And over the years, I've rethought that and really rethought whether any ideology is worth clinging to, like some sort of religion. And now we have this new threat of the coronavirus. And as a political scientist, I have to say, it seems clear to me that the greater threat is not directly from the coronavirus, but from how people react to it. Um, and I guess what I wanted to do today then was to sit back and reflect, because I think that immediate reactions are almost always what get us into trouble. But what I've been doing for the past couple of years in particular is going through an awful lot of reading and thinking and discussing with people, trying to get a grip on where we're at right now, economically, politically, in the United States, in Europe, around the world, and to try to figure out if there are any avenues for improvement, I guess you might say, looking at the system in a clear-eyed way. And so what I want to do kind of on the occasion where we're faced with this global epidemic that has really shaken our expectations about, more or less about the health of our economies, even more so our political systems. I wanted to reflect on drawing from some of the lessons that I think I've begun to learn from my studies. And the first one I've mentioned already is that economic globalization has not necessarily made us more secure. We were told that it was quite obvious, and this is a book that I read in grad school. It was quite obvious that economic interdependence would cause countries to seek peaceful solutions, and that we would have more peace as a result if we more or less allowed capitalism to become globalized and for all the countries of the world to become very interdependent upon each other. But that hasn't happened. I'm not even going to go into the many ways in which that hasn't happened. I'm sure you can think them all up for yourself. In addition to the fact that there are still many wars, many interventions, and so on, the economy that we have now functions best only under optimal conditions when the rate of growth is increasing. Not just that there is growth, but we now pay attention to, is the rate of growth ever increasing? That is, from a common sense perspective, completely untenable and unrealistic. And when you look at it, as I've tried to look at it over time from a more objective stance, it's a fairy tale, and it's a destructive one. That a healthy economy can only be created on the basis of increasing rates of growth. One of the fallouts of this mentality that there has to be growth at all cost, and is the development of this rather large global underclass that exists in all countries, has been offset particularly to the developing world, that is necessarily politically unstable. And I think this is part of what we're seeing now, is that underclass in various parts of the world, both in the developed and the developing countries, is becoming unsettled and is supporting more populism, right-wing populism, left-wing populism, and also just conspiracy theory thinking. And there is a lack of imagination on the part of leaders as to where the problem really lies, and what to do about it. But it's always been the case that the more poor and insecure people you have, people who are, as we say, one paycheck away from total poverty and have no security of any kind, the more of those people you have, the more politically unstable society will be. If you happen to have some sort of democracy, you are maybe particularly vulnerable to the effects of an increasing underclass. Another thing that's become clear to me is that our supply model in developed countries is inherently weak. It's genius when it works, because retailers, for instance, don't have to purchase any more than they absolutely need from suppliers. To maximize their profit, they don't have to keep a lot of inventory, but you're one crisis away from not having enough supplies. While the supply sits in major warehouses somewhere, maybe not even in your country, it's not in your stores and in your local areas where it can be had by people. So this is called the just-in-time supply model. I think it's been, particularly prevalent in the last 20 years, and it's gotten better and better as the vectorialists, as Mackenzie Warwick would say, have increased their computing power, their ability to figure out exactly what is wanted, when, and where. But for a society to have little to no inventory or reserve on hand to deal with exigencies is not smart. It basically created this notion that we would never run out, that everything would always be smooth. And so we didn't have to really think ahead and think about preparing for disruptions in the supply chain. This just-in-time model encourages short-term thinking. And short-term thinking, again, it's great when everything's running smoothly, not so great when it's not. In the past couple of years, I've spent quite a bit of time talking about our food system. I put up a number of videos in environmental political thought playlists, and I spent quite a bit of time thinking about this issue, and it became clear to me that I think this is up here, those big vast rows of corn, right, that you can't eat, are a real problem. It says something about where we're at in our thinking, that we would devote so much space and so much money, so much fuel, so much fertilizer, so much ground, literally, to a crop that one can't eat, and a faith in a system in which if we manage to sell our commodity crops, we can buy what other food we need. Does it not seem silly for countries to not have factored in food into their national security plans? How long can we last without food and clean water? So this model of agriculture is fragile. It really is. I mean, it's been sold to us as a great strength, right? Because it produces, I'm not even sure what it produces. It's not producing prosperity for the farmers. We can ask them that. I'm sure they will confirm that. One thing we know is it depletes our soil, it pollutes our water supply, it creates conditions in our soil that make it less fertile and less capable of transitioning, if we have to transition, to a type of agriculture that will keep us in our various parts of the world supplied with enough food that we need to live. I think this is something that every country needs to think long and deep about, whether food is not something that ought to be very much less connected to global supply and demand, and should be something that every country fosters and develops for itself, so that what is traded internationally then becomes the surplus. I've spent quite a bit of time on the weaknesses of liberal and neoliberal thought. I'm just going to collapse those two for a moment because for the purposes of this point, it doesn't really matter. It's become very clear to me that liberal thought and practices erode traditional sources of strength. Now, normally, this would sound like a conservative point. It's ironic beyond belief that today's conservatives don't really see this. I'd like them to see this. Liberal thought and practice have eroded the foundations that societies use to keep themselves afloat, the traditional sources of strength, such as family and friendship. Right? Families in a liberal economy go where the jobs are. They are encouraged to spend a lot of time thinking about job and career and not the stability of the family. We've seen a breakdown of the family, and I include friendship in that because for me and a lot of the rest of you, friends are family. But it's difficult under the conditions in which we live, where we have to disperse to the four winds and have to think about our economic prospects first to develop solid friendships as well. But I think ultimately family and friendship can only be solid if you stay relatively put and if you're fairly close. Because yes, I can talk to somebody on Facebook and catch up with them, but I can't really help them out unless I just want to send them some money any other way than being fairly close to them. I did a series on Walter Brueggemann's Another Kingdom, and in it I dwelled on the way in which our churches have become so liberal, in a sense, by which I mean that Christians, for instance, in the United States are encouraged to think in terms of their individual relationship with God. Churches generally, they promote programming that is of a sort of therapeutic nature in small groups and things like this, but they have failed to really create communities in the strongest sense of the word. And as a result, they are among the institutions whose mission and values have become narrower and narrower. They often resemble a sort of corporate mentality that is not conducive to people truly being resilient and helping each other in a really solid way. We all know that the just-in-time economy and the emphasis on specialization has created a loss of ability. They don't know how to solve everyday problems because they're overly reliant upon specialized knowledge. And so when facing a crisis, it's more difficult, I think, for people to use their common sense. Long time ago now, in Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam pointed out that our civic organizations are deteriorating and aren't able to supply the community with structure and reliability. Civic organizations were and should probably be a part of citizenship, but we see now citizenship and our political systems are eroding as well. Citizenship in the truest sense relies upon people thinking that they have some connection to the community, the larger community, that their good is tied up with the good of the larger community. We aren't trained to think that way now, and our economic system does not support that way of thinking right now. But these are all traditional sources of strength that are either weak, eroding, or disappearing at this point in time. These are sources of cooperation that would help us to be able to get through any sort of crisis like this. I would encourage everybody listening to me to think about those categories, and if there's at least one of them, including family and friendship, the first one, that you could strengthen, that you could do, real tangible things now to strengthen. Um, those are not feel-good, fuzzy categories. Those are the categories of civilized life. And we have a responsibility to ourselves and those around us to strengthen those rather than continue to allow them to erode. And especially now. Finally, the current economy is weak because it heightens the emotional factor. It's not based on real needs anymore. It's based, or at least its health seems to be based upon sentiment. That affects, of course, we see it most palpably in the ups and downs of the stock market. Um, but because it's based upon fluctuations in sentiment and mood, it produces amplified consequences, both positive and negative. So when you combine something like the coronavirus pandemic with an economy as fragile and as moved by emotion as this one, the effects of this, which are substantial in a concrete way, become unnecessarily amplified. The only thing I can say at this point in time is that we ought to observe that, and we ought to be thinking about ways in which we can make that not be the case in the future. Maybe there are ways in which economies will have to adapt in the next few weeks and months that we ought to consider hanging on to or using to further think about how we could produce a more stable, secure economic system that isn't overly moved by fleeting fears and sentiments. So next week, I'll either be putting out a lecture I did in the classroom on Machiavelli and his treatment of Moses, or I may have my first interview with a friend of mine. Actually, it's more of a discussion. And then after next weekend, I will start in on a discussion of two different books that I think kind of are in dialogue with each other, at least in my mind. The Green State and Desert, or the Desert Manifesto, which is a anarchist work. So I will put links below to both of those so that people who want to read along can do so. So one way or the other, I'll see you next weekend.